So I've got the corner apart today, and I thought while it was all disassembled, I'd go through and show basically how I mount things, what I do to reprep, all the little tricks that have worked over the past 14 stage events or so, and 8 to 10 rally sprints, and see how things are holding up. So right here, I've got my Intrax suspension all mounted, and this has been on here for a few events now. And so I just want to go through what I did to actually mount my my flexible brake hoses here. I've got, this is an Intrax bracket. So the suspension comes with this bracket set up with this awesome P-clip with the rubber protective cover for you to use for your soft lines here. And what I've done is I bent it for the angle that I liked, but I also left the P-clip loose. So this is a lock nut, but I didn't tighten it down all the way. I let this rotate so that when the steering articulates, when the suspension articulates, this isn't holding the line in place, which is causing a kink maybe when you bend all the way one way. So I just let this freely move wherever it wants. And then if we look in back, what I'm also doing is I've actually got a spring in here that is pulling on the flange that comes on the stock soft lines for these cars, and that's holding this away from the back of the suspension, so that even as this thing goes up and down and moves around, there's no chance of the line actually rubbing on the back side of the coils or of the lower housing body here. The other thing you'll notice on these soft lines is I've got just some abrasive covers on here that I've zip tied on, and this is just so, you know, if you have a flat or anything, or the wheels or tire is rubbing against this brake line for some reason, you've got a little more protection, and this can just spin instead of actually digging in and chewing through the soft line itself. So just an added layer of protection. So if we go down to the suspension bolts here, I've got everything paint marked after I've got my alignment in place, and I'm happy with where things are at. So these are the paint marks that we're going to check in service, make sure nothing's loosened up or moved, which I've actually only had that happen once or twice over all the events. Once was just a few months ago at Bristol, which was a super rough event. And we came into service, we lifted the car up, we looked at the paint marks, they were off. We immediately knew we had to go after that before we get the car on the ground again. So also, what I deal with a lot with reprep is making sure that the bellows on the CV boot on both ends are good, and also the bellows on the steering rack are good. So I've been lucky in that I haven't really had any catastrophic tears on CV boots, but what I do get are little nicks, usually by the larger diameter of the boot. And rather than throw the whole boot out and try to reboot it, what I've been using is actually this 3M weather strip adhesive to touch up those small nicks. And this is flexible enough that it seals and it moves with the boot, and it's done a pretty good job of keeping the nicks from growing larger and keeping me from having to go in for a full replacement and do some major surgery on an axle. Obviously, if the tear is anything larger than about 1/4 inch, 3/8 of an inch, the adhesive wouldn't work. It's not going to help you out, but it is a stopgap measure in between ignoring it or taping it and full replacement if you've got time between events. Also here, I've got my wheel scraper set up. This has been on the car for 3.5 years now. These are actually the original front plates still. So these don't wear nearly as quickly as the rear wheel scrapers, and that's just mounted to a single bolt. This is actually, I think a sensor hole or an ABS wire hole on these knuckles from the factory. So I've stolen that, and I've made just a mild steel bracket that was painted at one point in time, but now it's all sandblasted away to hold this plastic. So I've got my Sealsaver as well off right now so I can clean and re-grease these shocks, but that'll be going back on. And I don't even use zip ties to hold this on. This is heavy duty Velcro, and this is enough that I really don't have to worry about this tearing off, and I don't have any tears in the Sealsaver now. Up top, we've got similar paint markings on all the critical bits. So I've locked in my adjustable top hats, and I've got paint marks on those, paint marks on all the actual top hat bolts. And then what I've done to mount my Intrax remote reservoirs here is put riv nuts in the firewall, and then mount the included P-clamps that come with the Intrax in there to hold the reservoir. So this is nice and simple to zip right off and get out of the way if I need to pull this out and service the suspension. One last thing I wanted to point out with these wheel well liners. So I have been running the factory wheel well liners on all 4 corners, and even the front covers too. And this does wonders for actually keeping dirt and debris out of the front subframe area and areas that are really inaccessible and hard to clean and hard to get packed mud out of there. The only difference is that rather than clipping it to the outside of the fender like the factory did, I actually used M6 bolts and riv nuts. So I drilled out the fenders, I put riv nuts in all along the fender and mounted it with some button head screws, some low profile screws that aren't going to tear up the tread of the tire if the tire contacts one of these on its way to contacting the fender. And it's been fantastic. I mean, the original factory liners after 14 events or so, that's I'd do it all over again. And you can actually still buy these fender liners from Subaru directly if you wanted to go to a dealership and order a couple for GC and get them mounted in. So for the rest of the prep, what we're doing is we actually just did a wheel bearing. This is the last original wheel bearing on the car from the build in 2019. So it lasted 4 years. I think average wheel bearing life on this car is probably around 2 years between all 4 corners. Certainly it's driver's side, so it got beat up a little less than the others. But we've repressed in our hub with our ARP studs. We checked out the hub itself. We made sure that the bore was okay. If you're pressing in too many bearings to these, you can actually wear out the bore and leave play in the bearing, and then you'll be chewing through bearings in no time. The bearings will last like 1 event or even less. So it pays to have a steady supply of these knuckles from somewhere. Yeah, so that's about it. I'm gonna check the underside bolts on the control arm here. I'm gonna check my ball joint, my tie rod end, make sure I don't have any play in that. And that's a basic reprep on a single corner.